So for folks in the room, you can step up to the microphone if you have a question for any of the Decadal Survey talks we just had. While you're queuing up, I'll bring you up to date on the discussion that's been going on in the chat so you don't miss out. Brett Jolliffe asked, how do or did the activities of other spacefaring nations with interest in the moon factor into the Decadal Survey recommendations? And Robin has replied to that in the chat. And she says, international collaborations are discussed in particular in the human exploration chapter. Example, in relating to developing agreements for responsible ISRU, as Jen mentioned, and in discussion of possible collaboration in strategic lunar missions in chapter 22. The committee recognized the varied plans for lunar exploration by many spacefaring nations and endeavored to make recommendations to support and continue U.S. leadership in lunar science, notably by Endurance A, as well as other lunar science activities. So now we'll switch to in-room.
Hi, Dana Hurley from APL. Thank you all so much for all the hard work you put into the Decadal. I was wondering, the LDEP budget line that you all have there, what sort of things does that fund?
Well, this is Phil. I'll take a shot at it. We basically started with the current funding for LDEP and projected that through the decade. For much of our report, we tried to set high-level goals and objectives and not get too prescriptive on exactly how NASA should organize or spend the money. Our main focus was to say this is important, and as was said earlier, it's a significant amount of money. So I think we think the evolution of missions should be left to the program, to the strategic thinking, but that we tried to give a big enough pot of money that there was a lot of options for CLIPS missions, rover missions, and then of course, Endurance A.
Yeah, and Dana, I'll just add in what LDEP funds now, at least part of it. It funds Viper, Lunar Trailblazer, I believe Dolly, CLIPS, and PRISM are the main ones.
Melissa Lane, Fibernetics. This is a question for you, Jen. You talk about the potentially putting science payloads down with the astronauts. And I'm just wondering if there was any discussion about fractions of, what payload fractions might be dedicated to science? A little bit.
Well, as scientists, we want as much as possible.
Right.
But the short answer is, I think the Artemis 3 science definition team report went into that in more detail because there has to be a partitioning. We don't know what the down mass will be yet, but there needs to be a partitioning between in situ handheld field instruments, sampling, containers and equipment, and then deployable field instruments, long-term, long-lived deployable instruments. So those are sort of the three categories. We didn't divvy that up. We didn't get into that level of granularity for that, but we're trying to make sure that the requirements from science get into the human exploration architecture, because we're already seeing how limited, down mass and up mass from the moon is severely compromising science.
But how about a level higher than that, versus what the needs are, crews that get sent down versus science in general, not necessarily discriminating among what science packages go down?
Yeah, I can say that is actively being worked internally at NASA because, right, there are crew requirements, and then we also want to send science gear. So I can't comment on the specifics. We didn't specifically get into the partitioning of mass in the Decadal survey, but that is something that's being internally worked because we have to.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Steve Simon, University of New Mexico. A lot of the depictions of the Artemis hardware, like we just saw in the last presentation, show a huge giant rocket on the surface. Is that really what's being considered? And how do the astronauts get down to the surface? Aren't they at the top of the rocket?
Okay, I'll address that. So the current architecture is the astronauts launch on the SLS, which has the Orion capsule on the top. That capsule, the Orion capsule, flies to the moon, docks with the Gateway that we heard about, which is sort of a lunar station. And then the HLS system is the human landing system, which is also docked with Gateway. And that's the vehicle that brings the astronauts from the Gateway to the lunar surface and then back up. And the company that's on contract with HLS is SpaceX. And their Starship vehicle is the vehicle that was selected by NASA to bring the astronauts to the lunar surface and then back up. So that rendering is correct. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Why is it so big compared to the lunar module? Isn't what's in it?
Well, we don't know what's going to be in it yet, but that's the design that SpaceX proposed to NASA and that NASA selected. We can talk offline about other motivations for developing that vehicle, but yeah. We do have a question online from Karen Johnny. Is there a possibility in the future to find synergy between astrodecadal science priorities, including cosmology, gravitational waves, exoplanets, with this decadal's recommendations for science from the moon? Anybody want to take that?
Sure. I actually just sent a response.
Oh, I see it now.
Yeah. Clearly, the scope in terms of the science that we were to prioritize here was planetary science and astrobiology. So that's the specific science that we made recommendations on. However, the points in the human exploration chapter are broader than that, about the need for scientific advances and expanding human knowledge as being a primary motivator of a sustained program of human exploration. That philosophy obviously supports scientific advances across any field, right? It's a much more general philosophy, I think.